Hi, Larry.
Hey, Ann.
How are you?
Okay, so it's just the two of us for now, right?
Yeah. People usually start drifting in between now and 6 o'clock, a little after 6.
I'm sorry, between now and 5 o'clock, right?
Right, that's right. It's 5 o'clock. Yeah, 5 o'clock, not 6 o'clock. If they drift in at 6 o'clock, they're too late.
A bit. Yeah. Anyway, did they ever send you a disc, or did you just use the YouTube link for the video?
I did not get a YouTube link for the video. I have not seen any video from Great Decisions about China and Africa.
Really?
Yeah, have you?
No.
I mean,
Not at all. I haven't seen. I don't know. I thought you guys were gonna have the YouTube video.
no, and in fact, this is our third session. There's only been one session that anybody has been able to see a video.
Well, you mean
Yeah.
what's going on? Is Great Decisions, having problems, or what's?
Jerry said that the pandemic, they said the pandemic really slowed them down in terms of producing these videos. So,
Oh, producing them.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's true. They have to, each session has to be produced.
Yeah. So,
Uh-huh. Okay, well then, what we'll do is we'll basically talk.
yeah, that's what we've been doing.
Okay.
Really. Yeah, and it's been fine. People have things to say.
No,
Did you serve in Africa at all?
Yes, I did. I served in Nigeria
Oh,
and in Lagos, and I also in 2012 and 2013 I went to South Sudan.
oh wow.
That was not directly with the State Department, however. It was a contractor.
Uh-huh.
And, we were teaching, delivering courses for their foreign ministry,
Oh, really?
which of course, South Sudan, at that time, their foreign ministry was less than a year old. So
Yeah.
it was brand new. But anyway, I'll talk, since we'll now have a little more time without the video.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry. I thought you knew that there would be no video.
no, I just thought that they would, be able to deliver it. So if they haven't produced a video for this, do you know what sessions they have produced video for already, or?
The only one that I've seen the video for is the global supply chains.
Okay.
And we did that last week.
Okay.
Hopefully by the time it's because you're doing the Persian Gulf security, hopefully we'll have a video for that.
Yeah, Persian Gulf security. Yeah, that would be fun. Yeah, I mean to have something, but actually, I served back in Washington in the late '90s. I was in the Office of Energy,
Oh, really?
which of course, you could put a slash next to that and say Persian Gulf, but I would go to Paris for these meetings of the International Energy Agency,
Mhm.
IEA, and it was the Committee on Emergency Questions, which meant, what do you do if, basically, what happens if there's an interruption in tanker traffic through the Straits of Hormuz,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And this is, of course, a committee of, oil consuming countries.
Mm-hmm.
So so that when we were looking at security back then, it was, we're looking at oil interruptions and things like that.
Yeah. I had an uncle who was one of the founding employees of Aramco.
Oh my goodness, that's coming back a ways.
Yeah, and he lived in, well, he was in World War II. So, and he's been dead for several years, but he raised his kids in Dhahran.
Well, that would have been the generation right there.
Yeah. Mhm.
right after World War II. I mean, oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia in the 30s, and so one of the reasons that the United States was so focused in the Middle East right towards the end of World War II was because of the discovery of oil.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
I guess they didn't want the Germans to get it, and they didn't want the
Well,
Russians.
this oil had been discovered and produced in Iran and in Iraq at the time of World War I. But Saudi Arabia hadn't been really surveyed or explored. And then about the mid to late 30s is when they first I think were Americans who actually discovered discovered oil, and so it really wasn't in production until really after the war when they started producing.
Yeah. You had a nice career there.
Yeah.
Then. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hello.
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 Hi, Dick.
Hi,
Hello.
Dick.
Hi, Ann.
So Richard, you're actually standing on kind of on your head there, in this. I don't know. You're kind of sideways.
Sideways.
I understand. I'll try to switch it over.
That's okay. I mean, we don't know, baby. There you go.
Oh, look at that.
There you go.
If only the world could change direction so easily.
There you go. Yeah.
Wouldn't that be nice?
And was there a link to the video for?
No, there was no video.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
I was just telling Larry that Great Decisions apparently has had a lot of issues because of the pandemic in producing the videos. So hopefully by the time we come back next week, there's no program. But the following week, hopefully we will have a video for that.
Okay,
No, I
think it
would have
works.
sent the link if there was.
sure.
I think it works pretty well. Is that you? Is that David Sachs?
It is. How are you, Dick?
Good. My sister was with me for this today.
Oh,
Sort of interesting. She's a storyteller from the West Coast.
oh yeah,
That's her profession.
A storyteller.
storyteller. Wow.
And she's written several books on storytelling. She's an interesting person.
Yeah.
Hey, so what time is this thing supposed to begin?
5 o'clock tonight.
5 o'clock.
Now, in Native American culture, the role of storyteller is very honored. It's part of their traditions, and they make sculptures, which you can buy in souvenir shops. You can also buy it in galleries. They're called storytellers, and it's usually a woman with children on her lap.
Well, my sister doesn't have any children.
Okay.
She's got a lot of close relatives.
Yeah, well, she can certainly borrow children. That's part of storytelling.
Yeah. So, what do you think about this tool for teaching?
Zoom?
Automatic thing is speaking here. Hold on. Call it pull aid.
So we'll wait one more minute and see if other people can
Okay.
join us. Some people may not have been able to do 5 o'clock. Does anybody mind if we record this?
No, no.
No, go ahead.
Because I'd like to, we recorded the first one and then one of the participants said that she didn't want to be recorded, so. But I think it's a good service to put on YouTube, on the library YouTube channel, so if you're okay with that.
Yeah, my son is in South Africa, and we periodically go down there and see him in South Africa.
Mhm.
Just
Nice.
as clear as can be.
Yeah, it's great.
Technology.
Technology is amazing.
Yeah. Talking about technology, where's it going to be in 10 years?
I don't
Well,
know.
this,
Well, I have to say, we were stationed in Lagos in the early 2000s, and we had for the my kids at the time, at least my daughter was back in the States, and we actually set up instant messaging,
Oh, yeah.
which blew us away. The ability to do instant messaging. This would have been like 2000, 2001. We had that little camera on top of the computer,
Oh, yeah.
and we thought that was like the coolest thing to have instant messaging. Now, of course, we're all instant messaging, and
Right,
that's
right.
what this all is.
Yeah.
Well,
And it's technology that's been around a long time.
Yeah.
The application hasn't been.
Yeah, yes. So let's see. So we might as well get started. And if other people come into the waiting room, we'll let them in. It's great to see you all. We have a new person tonight, Tom Schmoyer. It's nice to see you, Tom. I'm happy to introduce Larry Cohen, who is a retired State Department diplomat and member of the Foreign Service and also a member of the World Affairs Council. So I'll give my usual pitch. If you are not a member of the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading, you should become one if you like
There
great
you go.
decisions. So I'll turn it over to you, Larry.
thank you, Ann. Yes, Ann is correct. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. I actually spoke at Great Decisions a year ago, Ann, at Wyomissing Library,
Yes.
just as the pandemic was breaking out.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
And we were all, well, and at that time, our idea of social distancing was to have all the chairs around the edge of the room.
Mm.
Little
Yeah.
did we know.
Well,
But-
hopefully next year we'll be back in
Yeah,
the
well,
library.
hopefully, but it's certainly been a challenge. I hope everybody is keeping safe. This topic's of interest. A little bit about myself. I started in the Foreign Service in 1980 when Ed Muskie was still Secretary of State, and I retired in 2007. So that would have been when Condoleezza Rice was Secretary of State. And I just want to do a moment to reflect on George Shultz, who certainly among the Foreign Service was considered one of our truly outstanding secretaries. He had a lot of integrity. People really enjoyed working for him. And I just do a shout out to Secretary Shultz, who passed away a few days ago at age 100. Now, my career was never quite as extraordinarily as George Shultz's, but I did serve in Africa in the early 2000s. I was the economic counselor in Lagos, Nigeria. I also went back to Africa in 2012 and 2013 on a contract to South Sudan, to Juba, which was, and I believe still is, the newest independent country in the world. So I certainly have some Africa experience. I also was, in my younger days, in the 1980s, I was the desk officer for the African Development Bank, which is headquartered in Abidjan. And on and off, I've had some interaction with Africa. I've served all over the world, so Africa is just one portion of what I've done. I've also been to China, where I was visiting as a part of a delegation on oil and gas issues. So when it comes to China and Africa, I think I probably can speak most about the energy sector than about some of these others. I hope everybody had a chance to read the article in the Great Decisions booklet. My own critique of it, I think it was fairly well addressed. China's interest in Africa clearly goes back a good 50 years or longer, right to the time of when the African nations were becoming independent. Decolonization was taking place. The reasons, the rationale for China's involvement, I think, are fairly well described in the booklet. However, I do want to emphasize back in the 60s and 70s, the rivalry with Taiwan was a real driver of China's activities, not just in Africa, but throughout the world, in Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean. The reason being that it was unclear until China got her seat in the United Nations, which country, whether it be Communist China or the Republic of China, which country was actually going to derive most diplomatic recognition. The United States, of course, had been favoring Taiwan, Republic of China, and until the opening of that country during the Nixon administration, our advocacy was in favor of the Republic of China, in favor of Taiwan. Once the United States established diplomatic relations with China, with Communist China, the PRC, once the PRC joined the United Nations, sitting in the chair, China's chair in the Security Council, then things began to shift much more quickly. But I would say that part of China's strong presence in Africa was simply to establish a foothold in these countries in order to gain diplomatic recognition by offering support and development assistance to these countries. China earned a lot of their appreciation in the form of diplomatic recognition, and that was really the big difference maker. According to the article, the only country now in Africa that does not have diplomatic relations with the PRC is Swaziland, which still has relations with Taiwan. So that's certainly well worth China's effort. Remember, in the Security Council, no continent has more members in the General Assembly than Africa. Africa has more General Assembly members than any other continent. So, from that point of view, China has been deeply engaged in African affairs. Also, wish to point out that China's perspective, unlike ours, China's perspective has always been much more strategic and long-term in thinking, whereby our thinking tends to be limited to, in business, it could be limited to the next quarter, but could be limited to fiscal years or terms of office or whatever. In China, their time horizon for thinking strategically is far longer. So when they're looking at they're providing assistance or loans to African countries, they're really not thinking of tomorrow or the next year or maybe even the next 10 years, but the next 50 years. And they consider their role and presence in these countries to be very, very long-term, very strategic. I'd also say that in my experience, China's role in countries in Africa and elsewhere has been very heavily focused on resource exploitation, not just in Africa. This was true in South America. You'll see this in Peru, Ecuador, even Brazil. I saw this as a Foreign Service officer in China, where in Afghanistan, where China had had a major investment going on with a copper a large copper mine south of Kabul. These are projects that are enormous in size. They all require a very high level of sophistication, transportation infrastructure. That seems to be the direction that China has taken, and largely because over the long term, China requires natural resources for its own economy. When I was in South Sudan, the big issue there was the South Sudanese production of oil, that the pipeline that they used to go to the Red Sea went through Sudan. So South Sudan and Sudan had, of course, been in pretty much of a civil war situation, yet the oil fields in South Sudan depended on Sudan in order to get oil to the ports on the Red Sea. China was very heavily focused on that issue because where did the oil go? Where would it go? It went to China. We see that in throughout Africa. A lot of the infrastructure that the Chinese have funded has been in a way designed to exploit resources, whether it be mining or timber, whatever. That largely, it's almost like the post-colonial colonists the Chinese are seeking to exploit in this way African nations. Also, what struck me very much in the article was the fact that the Chinese do not issue grants as much as they issue loans. So much of the assistance that China has provided to African nations, according to this article, and I have no doubt that it's correct, is that they provide long-term, perhaps low-interest loans. However, in the African setting, it becomes very difficult to repay these loans without getting into a debt trap. So whereby Western countries, the United States, European countries have, over the last 30 years, have tried to get away from a lot of these interest-bearing loans and go to more concessional lending. The Chinese a little bit more exploitative as far as their lending terms, and this creates high levels of debt for these African countries. It just is a drag, potential drag on their economies. I don't know if anything regarding the article, if any country in Africa has actually taken over any Chinese assets, whether they've confiscated or whether they've taken kind of broken the whatever loan contract that they had. My assumption is at this point in time, most African countries are probably honoring their contracts with the Chinese to the extent that they can, and if they cannot pay, the Chinese will come in and perhaps renegotiate the terms of the loan. So this is not based on the generosity of the Chinese. This is not like USAID or the Europeans who will provide assistance much more focused on basic development needs. The Chinese focus on infrastructure and contracts that work for the benefit of Chinese corporations.
If I can, this is Richard Stringer. What I've noticed when I was in Ethiopia, which is where I was for 2 years in the Peace Corps, there weren't any paved roads.
Mhm.
There were no paved roads, and I'm talking about an area called Mekelle in northern Ethiopia. So when I went back there after two years in Ethiopia, guess what were spanking brand new items, very common in the country. I'll answer it for you. They had a railroad system. They had several universities. Once again, all these projects, these really substantial, technologically amazing projects, They're all financed by the Chinese. As you said, they must be very much in bed with them, so to speak. So it's going to be really interesting in the future. You hear about the Cold War and all that stuff. But it's the advancement, and apparently they're acting that way.
Mhm.
Apparently they're acting that way in all over Ethiopia. And don't think for 1 minute that there's not an intention with these technological. I want to show you. Here's a. See if I can get it on the screen here.
You're going to have to lower your camera a little bit because all we see is the top of your head.
How's dandruff?
Uh-huh. Anyway, you're absolutely correct. The United States back in the 50s, post-war period in the 50s, maybe even in through the 60s, but not very much further than the 70s, we were in the infrastructure game. Yeah, there's the Great Decisions booklet. The United States would fund dam building, road building. In certain countries, we build airports, but we got out of that business pretty much in the 1980s, and we were completely out of that business by the 1990s. And then our assistance would focus on capacity building, rule of law, education, institution building. The Chinese actually went and filled in the gap that the United States and European countries, as they were getting away from these high cost, big prestige projects, railroads and dams, et cetera. The Chinese came back and filled the gap. And it is true, what you see today in Africa is a lot of Chinese built infrastructure. Railroads, absolutely. Port facilities, the Chinese have been masters at that. And as the Great Decisions magazine points out, as that article points out, it's probably for the best, because there's no way that we could compete with the Chinese, certainly dollar for dollar, and as far as our capability in building a lot of this infrastructure. The real issue is at what cost, and are the African nations going to be too deep in mortgage to the Chinese for this infrastructure that the Chinese have funded through loans? And I don't necessarily have an answer for that. Technologically, the Chinese have also come in a big way. They, at the time when I was there, the cellular technology was just coming into play in these African countries. So 20 years ago, a country like Nigeria had the second worst teledensity in the world. And I would mention this at forums and whenever I was speaking publicly to Nigerian audiences, and they would kind of chuckle and say, well, which country is worse than us? And I would say Afghanistan. And then, of course, they got it. Okay. So in the intervening 20 years, you could not find a Nigerian who doesn't have a cell phone. And in fact, even in Afghanistan, you can't find an Afghan who doesn't have at least one cell phone, and their cab drivers have 2 or 3 cell phones. So, so this technology, in some ways, this is pretty kind of somewhat difficult for us to appreciate. I saw this in India, that because these countries did not have the old technologies, the early 20th century technology of wire telephones, for example. They didn't have telephone lines. They didn't have infrastructure such as we take for granted in the United States. So when companies started coming in the late 90s, early 2000s with cellular technology, countries like India, countries like Nigeria jump started directly into cellular technology. They're not stuck with all the infrastructure that we have, like landlines. They don't have copper wires running all over the place, which is, again, a 100-plus-year-old technology. They don't have that because they never went through that phase of communication. And so this is where the Chinese have really exploited this situation, because they themselves jumped right into the new technology. They didn't have Red China PRC was not wired for telephone communication. They went pretty much directly into cellular technology, and so they had a pattern that they could then utilize when they took the technology to Africa, and that's certainly been to the Africans' benefit.
Can I ask you a question?
Mhm.
David Sachs, if the infrastructure that China built was designed for China's benefit, why couldn't the African countries insist that the financing be by grants as opposed to loans? Now, if Tesla wants to have charging stations all over the country so that people can use their cars, Tesla doesn't expect private property owners to pay for a charging station. Tesla builds it for its own purposes. So why this different model that the African countries are willing to be put into hock to build infrastructure for the Chinese?
Yeah, and another related point to that, David, is that at this point the Chinese have an immense mountain of hard currency reserves, because they've been running trade surpluses for, well, decades now with us and with most of the rest of the world. So they have huge currency reserves that are not earning much in the way of interest, of course. And they don't really have a way of divesting, of utilizing their reserves. So you could say that, well, why can't the Chinese give concessional lending and grant lending, grant funding to African countries? That's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is that the Africans themselves tend not to be very united. When if they were to say the African Union was to as one voice take this up with China, they may have more capability in getting such grants. However, African countries tend to be pretty divided and almost competitive in seeking help. It's also it is a bit kind of counterintuitive. You'd think the Africans would be able to leverage their markets, and in a way that they could get more from the Chinese, and maybe that's happening as we speak. I don't know, but certainly they're not taking full advantage of their inherent power. That's not just true of them, it's true of South America, the subcontinent. It seems like around the world, countries seem to be more in competition to get the Chinese to come in, and less as far as leveraging their own sway over the terms of the money. Again, just I can't speak with any authority, David, because I can't. I'm not questioning the Great Decisions article, but it certainly seems to me that the Africans, in particular, could be doing a better job leveraging their market.
Well, the other thing about it is it's not all negative. It may represent the advancement that we haven't had in that part of the world. I certainly find it very interesting, fascinating. As a matter of fact, that picture on the front of the World Affairs Council
Yeah.
bulletin for the month. It gives you an idea of how the volume of stuff being moved from one side of the ocean to the other. In fact, it's fascinating. Imagine loading all that stuff. It's so interesting. Logistically, how do you do it? Well, your profession is X-rays, isn't it, Dave?
Mine?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. What do you notice? Are there modern X-rays and CAT scans and all this stuff? I mean, some of the stuff I've seen in hospitals are incredible. In the last 20 years, we'll see what's happened.
I mean,
Rely on guys like you to keep us informed.
right.
Well, that also brings up an interesting point, and that is and this is probably not directly related to Africa per se, but the Chinese have sought to. I don't want to use the word steal, but probably that's probably the most appropriate word, intellectual property, including technology. And so from our point of view, from the point of view of, say, Western governments or Western corporations, China is a real tar baby to be involved with. They're dangerous. That is, U.S. corporations who are trying to protect their own intellectual property, and that's really how they're able to survive. That they are at risk of losing their intellectual property to China, because China doesn't have any scruples about stealing it. And so whereas China can take American technology and make it cheaper, expand production, and then turn around and either sell it back to us or whatever, they can also do the same thing and sell it back to, say, consumers in Africa or consumers in South America. And so a lot of what is going on, and a lot of what in China is in Africa, U.S. companies would be quite distressed, because in the long run, it's taking away from their potential markets, and that's a factor that's not really weighed here, because this isn't looking at it isn't really looking at the impact on U.S. business. But China's involvement in Africa is not having a positive impact on our trade and on our business interests.
Can I ask a question? I don't know if it's time for questions or should I wait? But
no, go ahead, Ann, absolutely.
I'm just thinking about the fact that almost all of Africa, except for Ethiopia, was under the rule of different colonial powers until they became independent. And I'm wondering if the colonial countries, for instance, if France's relationship with China has a bearing on Ivory Coast's relationship with China.
Mm-hmm.
If Ghana's relationship with China has a relationship, is kind of dependent on Great Britain's relationship.
By the way, I would add that there is a second country in Africa that claims that it was never a colony, per se.
Oh,
If anybody can guess what that is.
United States.
No, in Africa.
Swaziland.
No,
Oh,
Liberia.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They claimed, of course, that they are independent. Now, I think de facto they were pretty much a colonial relic, because their ties with us, but they actually were an independent, just like Ethiopia.
they ran the slave trade.
Yeah. Well, the answer, Ann, to your question is I don't think I know, and I don't think anybody else really knows for sure, because that's getting into getting pretty deep into the weeds. You're right, France for sure, with its extensive contacts still in West and Central Africa.
Yeah.
You have their interests. You know, the UK had interest, but I think pretty much, and especially in the 21st century, that's pretty much waned as far as say the French influence over governments. It's not like it was 50 years ago, soon after independence, where you still had these governments run with a lot of civil servants that were trained in France. I think
Right.
they many of these countries have pretty much moved on from that. So I suspect that a country like Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana, which the two you mentioned, that they pretty much operate without any real kind of focus or thought to their former colonial masters. Certainly, France has a different view of assistance to Africa than we do. Great Britain. I mean, there's a lot. Certainly each country has its own perspective, but I would say every European country is certainly monitoring what the Chinese are doing, because they are the new kid and the big bully, if potentially big bully, on the block. So I think it's a bit different. What we also have noticed that whereby Western governments in the United States have worked together to try to ameliorate the debt problems in Africa, worked to some of the organizations that I was working with early in my career regarding assistance to Africa, IFAD, and some of these other groups. The Chinese were not a part of that. The Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank at the time, China was nowhere to be seen. Now, I think even though they may not, be as kind of as important as setting policy in the World Bank or the IMF, now they are just as important a player as some of these Bretton Woods institutions. And of course, we have less of an influence over the Chinese than we do over the World Bank. So I think from a Washington point of view, they're watching what China's doing in Africa and elsewhere pretty carefully.
In a prior chapter from a year ago for Great Decisions, we talked about China in Africa also. And that chapter described the Chinese engagement in Africa in much more predatory terms. They described China basically as a loan shark whose behavior was motivated by an attempt to drive the countries into bankruptcy and therefore take over their resources and take over their ports, making predatory terms that were designed not to be able to be met so that their end game could succeed of taking over.
Yeah.
The chapter that we read for tonight does not have that flavor at all. In fact, it says the opposite. It says that when they've had opportunities to do so, they have declined, and that they really just want to have more of a standard business relationship. Why the discrepancy between those descriptions?
Well, I think, David, from what you could tell from my comments, I'm probably more in the predatory camp than in the benign camp. I think there's a flaw in this thinking, and that is that it's that that line that if you owe the bank $1,000, the bank has it controls you, but if you owe the bank a million or more, then you control the bank, that kind of thing. I think the Chinese and every country that is a lender country has to recognize that if you have infrastructure in that country and you get into a pissing contest, or you threaten that country with calling in your loans or whatever it is, don't believe for a moment that the country is just going to let you have control over the assets that is physically in their country. Okay. Look, just in our history, look at the oil companies in the 1930s down in Mexico. The Mexican government at that time had no qualms about taking over assets that were owned supposedly by U.S. companies. So I think what is not really spoken here is that if the Chinese try to come down too hard, what's to say that country X in Africa won't just turn its back and say, okay, we're not paying you back, and by the way, we're keeping the assets, come and get them type of thing. I think the Chinese have learned or are learning kind of the lessons that we and U.S. corporations have probably learned over the last 100 years, and that is, if these countries owe us $1 billion, they have a lot of leverage over us, just like we think that we have leverage over them, and that may be holding back some of the more predatory practices that he seems to kind of focus on. But I would say, from my perspective, I don't think there's any action that Chinese are taking here, which is not in their eyes of strategic value to them in the long term. I am convinced that China will always look beyond what we think of as normal time horizons and decide and determine what is best for them. And the difference between the Chinese government and Chinese corporations, I couldn't tell you what the difference is, because a corporation in China is not listed on the New York Stock Exchange the way they are. They really are under control of the Chinese government, and so any corporate decision being made in a place like Africa is really a decision being made by the Chinese government.
Does the U.S. do any strategic planning looking long term? I know we don't behave that way, but businesses, nonprofits, they get together and they create a 5-year strategic plan, and it has a whole bunch of tactics in there, and they revise the plan as circumstances require and as time changes. Do we have an approach that is similar to that?
This is a dicey question, because I'm only going to speak for the State Department. I'm sure that if you were to talk to somebody who is more familiar with the Defense Department, or somebody who comes out of the Treasury Department, and they'll have different perspectives. But from the State Department point of view, from my experience, yes, we thought very strategically about a lot of these issues, but that has not necessarily been the case over the last 4 years. And a large part of it is because in the State Department's situation, the State Department was not being run by State Department career professionals. It was being run by political appointees, way down to all the assistant secretaries in the State Department were political appointees. This is a situation whereby the professional foreign service was neutered. So if your leadership in a traditional presidential administration, your leadership at the very top is political, and then certain your ambassadorships, certain ambassadorships are political, of course, but at the assistant secretary level, you're looking for your best professionals because they run the show. But under the Trump administration, your political appointees came all the way down to the assistant secretary level. And the one assistant secretary slot that was not filled by a political appointee, ironically enough, given this discussion tonight, was the assistant secretary for African affairs. There was no political appointee put in that position. Why?
Because we
just
didn't
left it
care.
vacant. So for the last 4 years, essentially, it's been, the position itself has been vacant and been kind of run ad hoc by acting assistant secretaries, which shows that they weren't even interested in filling the slot. So at the end of the day, unless any of those non-career people had an interest in strategic thinking and allowing kind of this the stew to boil with thinking about where we should be in 5 or 10 years and et cetera, there has not been, to my knowledge, any real strategic planning that has gone on. Now, at the working level, people have been thinking, but there's been no action, no way to kind of bring this to the fore, because when you're doing these big strategic initiatives, you bring in different agencies, you bring in academics, it's a big, it's a lot of activity, and then it's distilled down into a plan, into a strategy that goes up the chain of command, and eventually gets approved by the deputies committee or even at the cabinet level. That hasn't taken place. So I don't know if there's anything out there that would reflect current strategic thinking. Anything that I'm sure that's been done is either stale or has kind of been stifled. So that I'm not trying to put a downer on this, but we have a lot of work to do to come back to our to where we were in thinking about China. A lot of what we've talked about in recent years about China has been rhetoric and the saber rattling type of noise and bad mouthing the Chinese, rather than thinking strategically on how we can work with these guys to the benefit of everyone. And that's going to be a problem now. Where are the China experts? Okay, where are the senior foreign service people who could lead on a strategic initiative? There's going to be a lot of work that has to be done. And my generation of foreign service officers have been pretty much, most of us have been squeezed out. So, where's that leadership going to come from?
See, there was a couple of questions I had.
No.
Tom, did you want to say something? Go ahead. Did you want to say something, Tom? You have to unmute yourself.
Oh,
How do you do that?
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, okay, go. Go ahead.
All right. World Affairs Council Book Club read Tom Burgess's book, The Looting Machine, a couple months back. And I've got some confusion on a whole bunch of things that you've discussed here. One that's foremost in my mind is you talked about the Chinese companies that are not on the New York Stock Exchange, mainly because they're probably being run by the president of China or his lackeys.
Or the Communist Party of China.
Well, yeah, but they're being run by a particular group of people. When we talk about the United States and trying to do something, my guess is we subcontract somehow, or the country subcontracts to somebody who can do communications or trains, railroads, whatever it might be. how does the United States compete when you have when you look at the big picture? Even if you have, I don't know, an IBM, Norfolk Western, some gigantic company in the United States is peanuts when you compare it to China and the total resources of China. How do we compete against that?
Boy, you hit the nail on the head. In the past, and when I say in the past, I'm going back 60, almost 70 years. The United States government, and this certainly after World War II, the United States government had a lot of that capacity itself. So when it did development work in Africa, the US government had expertise in dam building and had expertise in road building. And over time, then we started to, instead of holding that expertise at somewhat great cost within the US government, then we started contracting out to corporations that had the expertise. And at the beginning, it would have been your big, your Bechtels and your Knutsons and all, the big infrastructure and engineering firms. And then,
Halliburton.
then it went to over time to smaller consultancies. And so then for years, then it came down to the US would use what we would call Beltway bandit companies, companies that were situated in the Washington, D.C. area. And so the US government does not directly contract. We have to go through intermediaries. And then oftentimes those intermediaries go through other intermediaries. So when I was in South Sudan, I was hired by a company that was coming under an umbrella contract with USAID. I think in China, you don't have that situation at all. And so, in China, they can basically do almost anything without 13 layers separating, the decision makers from the guys in the field. And corporations are extraordinarily responsive to what the government tells them to do. So you're absolutely correct. Competing head to head, and again, giving our costs of labor and given some of our other issues, it's very difficult, if not impossible. And even in areas where we have advantages, areas where we have, again, intellectual property superiority or technological superiority, patents and copyrights don't necessarily work with the Chinese. So our companies are extraordinarily careful and reluctant to take some of this technology overseas where it could be copied and where the intellectual property could be stolen by the Chinese. So it kind of circular. I'm coming back to the point that no, we cannot compete head to head with most of the infrastructure. Where we can compete, and I think it comes out here, is that yes, we can compete on academics and on universities and on education. But I think the area where we are most competitive and the area where we have been least productive is on soft power. And I don't know if everybody here understands what that term means.
No, I don't.
Okay. Hard power think of hard power as Defense Department. Hard power is muscle, it's military, it's our ability to project force. Soft power is our ability to persuade and influence without using force. So soft power could be American culture. Soft power could be respect for American institutions. Soft power is the fact that countries will listen to the United States in a different way than they would listen to anyone else because of maybe a deep-seated respect. Soft power erodes. And the problem is that once it erodes, it's hard to get back. And unfortunately, American soft power has eroded quite a bit. And I don't know, again, how we're going to be able to get that our ability to influence and our ability to persuade back, our diplomatic skills. So think of soft power as diplomacy, public diplomacy, American libraries abroad, American culture, movies, music, you name it, free press. These are all forms of soft power. And unfortunately, as I said, they become very eroded. And the only real way that we can compete, I think, with the Chinese is in our capacity to regain our ability to use soft power.
Is the Peace Corps considered soft power?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, by the way, I want to say, Richard, you're not the only one to serve in the Peace Corps in Africa.
I did.
My wife, Anne, you did?
Mhm.
Okay. What country, Anne?
I was in Togo in West
Okay.
Africa.
I've been to Togo.
Mhm.
Marla, my
What-
wife served in Botswana.
Uh-huh. Oh, wow.
So,
What was it like? What was it like to teach over there?
well, she was a math teacher, and I think if you were to ask her, it was probably one of the premier experiences of her life. But the point that I'm making is that Peace Corps is a great example of soft power.
Yeah.
And what has happened with the Peace Corps? What has happened with the Peace Corps? They basically have been they've been pulled out.
Yeah. Because of
Okay.
COVID.
I think that pretty much you could. Now, I don't know if it's going to be able to make a recovery. I haven't heard anything from the Biden administration regarding that. I'm sure Tony Blinken and the people in the State Department would love to see a recovery of Peace Corps and other examples of soft power. But think of the influence that a few hundred Americans had just being in Africa, and mostly as teachers or engineers or forestry experts, or whatever it is. Think of the influence that they had on generations of Africans
Mhm.
and leadership in Africa, that the people that they knew back 30, 40 years ago then rose to become the intelligentsia or became the leaders of those countries. And so, yes, perfect example. And that's what really makes me very sad, because how difficult it is to resuscitate an institution such as the Peace Corps. I mean, they're really going to have to work hard. They're going to have to allocate funds. They're going to have to rebuild the institution from the ground up, and take a completely new perspective on things like security, on things like health. It's not like it was, Anne, say when you were Peace Corps volunteer.
It's very different.
Very different.
Yeah.
And I have to say, though, in my experience, and I served on 5 continents. I was very close to the Peace Corps in Honduras. I was very close to Peace Corps volunteers in Budapest, in Hungary, in the early 90s.
What'd you do?
I was a science in Hungary. I was a science and technology attaché, environment, science, and technology. So I was very close, because the Peace Corps was heavily engaged in environmental issues, and their role was, dollar for dollar and person for person, probably the most valuable asset that we had. I can't think of anything that we did better, except for the libraries that we had all over the world.
Yeah.
We had American libraries in communities everywhere in these countries, and we closed them all down.
Did they have outdoor movies?
Of course, when I was serving, they didn't have to do outdoor movies necessarily, but we had movie nights all the time. And and of course the locals would use the libraries because there was no other place for them to go. And so going to the American Library was a treat. And also in some libraries, we would be able to watch, say, the Super Bowl on tape delay because of the time difference. And so in India, we would watch the Super Bowl on Monday without commercials
Oh, wow.
because, of course, it was being sent out from USIS, from the United States Information Service, which could not play commercials. So you would get commercial-free coverage of the Super Bowl, which meant that you were watching a game for 55 minutes and it was over. So pretty interesting. But those assets, we've unfortunately lost most of them. And
If you notice somebody's trying to get started a Peace Corps magazine. Have you been getting literature on that?
I don't know.
Yeah, well, I've gotten 2 issues of it already.
I think that if we were to redo the Peace Corps, we'd have to rethink it in terms of the 21st century.
Yeah.
We couldn't ship out Peace Corps volunteers in the same manner that we did in the 50s and 60s and 70s. It's a different world. We have to rethink their value added. Okay, maybe it's not teaching math, in high school. Is it more, professors in universities? But another thing where we have a distinct advantage that we frittered away is exchange programs. And this is mentioned in the magazine, is the fact that one of our great influencers was having Africans come to the United States to learn, to receive an education. Frankly, that's been tossed in the waste can now, because we've made it so hard over the last few years for Africans and many people to even come to the United States as a visitor, let alone as a student. So it's this we have to rethink. We have to make it easier for Africans to come to the United States and go to American universities. We have to make it easier for them to have access to exchange programs and to that kind of thing. So we're going to have to rethink it from A to Z. We're going to have to rethink soft power. And that's the only way I think we can compete with anybody, especially the Chinese.
It's relatively easy for Chinese students to come here, isn't it?
No, I don't know if that's as true as before, but where Chinese have a distinct advantage, Anne, over Africans and over others, they pay retail.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's no, look, you have a Chinese student come to the United States and paying retail at American University. They're inherently subsidizing, implicitly subsidizing Americans who are going to that same university.
Right.
So there are very few Africans who could foot the bill. It's the same with, say, Saudis, and when they come to the United States, they don't get the wholesale rate; they get the retail rate.
Retail, yeah.
So, and that's the difference. What we should do, if we were thinking strategically, what we should do is make it as easy as possible for the best students to get an education here, and make it easy and I hate to call a brain drain. Brain drain is not healthy for these African countries, but we've really benefited.
Reviewing U.S. foreign policy and effort. China.
We've really benefited from that, from having people who come to the United States and stay here and become doctors and engineers and professionals. So it's not healthy for the countries they came from because they're losing that expertise, but the United States has really benefited from it.
Yeah. I know that you have another appointment.
Well, yeah, in about an hour, but we're safe now.
So, okay, I have another appointment in half an hour. So
anybody have any comments or any other questions or observations?
Yeah, one of the things that Burgess brought out in his book that we didn't talk about, it has to do with political leverage and loan debt with African countries where the Chinese, and as we have done before, and the Belgians and the French and everybody else have subverted the leadership and have been able to pay them big dollars to do the projects that the Chinese want to do by paying off the leadership. And he makes a big point of that in terms of a lot of, not only the African countries, but all over the world. But he had quite a bit on the African countries where presidents or prime ministers have hit big payoffs with the Chinese to do the kinds, and then the assets of the country get written into it because the prime minister or the president is getting paid off.
Yeah, good point. If I don't know if anybody has ever heard of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It dates from the 1970s. There had been some very big cases dating back, I believe, to the early 70s. I know Boeing might have been involved in it, AT&T, and some of the big American corporations had been doing exactly this, bribing senior government officials in foreign countries. And in the post-Watergate era, the United States went on a campaign to fight corrupt practices by American companies. We then had a problem whereby our Western friends or allies didn't have similar laws in their books. And so we then went to conventions, and of course the name escapes me right now, but we then in the 80s and 90s were engaged in negotiations on these anti-bribery conventions with the French and the Brits and the Japanese, et cetera. So now pretty much much of those corrupt practices have been either eliminated or diminished. However, now you still have the same behaviors being done by the Chinese. And so I honestly don't know, Tom, what the answer is going to be here, whether over time the Chinese can be leveraged or pressured. But certainly at this point in time, that's another mitigating factor that prevents American corporations competing on an even playing field with the Chinese.
Can I change the subject a little bit in terms of the article talked about the Chinese providing police and military supports to Africa. And one of the things I found surprising that he talked about was the Chinese naval patrols in East Africa to help against the pirating that's going on there.
Yep.
I'd be curious to know, how is any of that controlled? Are the Chinese on their own? Are they off somewhere else?
Well, I actually I'm a little bit familiar with that. In 2016, I spent a couple months in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, with what was called the Yemen Affairs Unit. We had just closed our embassy in Sana'a in Yemen, and they had pretty much relocated the embassy from Yemen to Jeddah because of the civil war that was going on in Yemen. And one of the issues that I was involved in for a very short period of time was this issue of maritime protection at the Horn of Africa. And yes, there was a piracy issue. There was also an issue of enforcing UN sanctions against the Houthis and try to prevent the smuggling of arms from Iran and all the oil shipments, et cetera, get food into the Yemenis without breaking the sanctions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, there was a Chinese presence there, But this was an international thing. This was not a China thing. And in fact, the headquarters of this coordination unit was in Djibouti, of course, a former French colony. But I think what was ignored was that it was not just a China-only effort. We had assets, the Brits had assets, and there were Arab assets like the Saudis. There were a number of countries collaborating on this, and in fact, I can't even remember the Chinese role being that significant. Anyway, Anne, any other thoughts from anyone, or any? Well, it's certainly been very very interesting. It's a shame we didn't get to see the video, but if there was no video produced, I guess that was
Yeah.
that was not.
You know, when we get, so this is the second video we haven't had. When they finally show up, I will be happy to send the links out. You know, even though we've already discussed the topic, it might enhance.
Now, I'm also going to be doing a Great Decisions presentation or facilitation with the Reading Library.
Oh, good.
So, and that'll be on the Persian Gulf security article.
Yes, and you're doing that for us too on March 1st.
Well, let me absolutely make sure that it's on my calendar. Yes,
Yes.
that is on March 1st.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I hope they will have the video for that. I
Yeah.
will send, so this is very important. There's no Great Decisions next week. We're taking a week off, and then we'll be back on the 22nd. And that the topic then will be the Korean Peninsula, and Kevin Coots, who facilitated last week, will be facilitating that week. So it'll be back, we'll be back on the 22nd at 6 o'clock. And if there's a video, if there's a video, I'll send you the link.
Great.
Okay. So I want to thank you all. I want to admit Nicole. Hi, Nicole. We're about to wrap up because we started at 5 o'clock. Maybe you didn't see that.
So the Chiefs lost.
So I want to thank you very much, Larry. This was great. Does anybody have any more comments or questions?
Thank you very much. It was very nice.
Yeah, thank
Good
you.
job,
Thanks a
Larry.
lot.
Thanks to all of you, and I hope, Anne, that we can do this next year back at the Wyomissing
I
Library.
hope so too. There's a lot of stuff I want to do back at the Wyomissing Library. This is one of them. So I hope that next year we can do it.
I would just
Yeah.
like to say, Ann, that this is Fred. I really appreciate Larry's hands-on experience. It was just.
Yeah, great. It's
Thank
really
you.
great.
I'm sorry.
That
Thank
comes
you.
from actually a career where you're a jack of all trades, but absolutely master at none.
Yeah.
Did a
That's
great
my
job.
line. Okay, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.
So long, everyone.
Thanks, Ann.
Okay,
Thank
thank you. Nice to see you all.